talk is Beyond Accuracy and Bias, the Pursuit of Ethical AI in Criminal Law. And this is work that I've been actually working on for the Oxford Handbook on Ethics and AI that Professor Huber is actually one of the editors of. And the way the talk is going to go is I'm first going to try to contextualize the phrase AI within a longer trajectory of statistical discourse within the U.S. penal system. So I am focusing specifically on the United States because that's where most of my work has been based, but I'd love in the Q&A to talk about parallels and divergences with the context here. After that, I'm going to talk about the aspirations and criticisms that have emerged in this current debate around algorithmic reform, before outlining some of the current work that's been going on in an attempt to render algorithms in the criminal justice system more fair, accountable, and transparent. Then I'm going to go on to make actually a critique of a lot of those efforts that are going on, particularly within present-day scholarship and academia, as well as within industry. And then I'm going to try to paint a picture about how we might think about moving forward based on those critiques that I made. So the term AI has really started to emerge in kind of government and policymaking circles over the last few years. And I think that's best reflected in kind of some of these excerpts from calls for proposals from the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm of the DOJ in the United States. And I think some of the language here is really interesting around kind of thinking about the potential of artificial intelligence for community safety in the reduction of crime. And really some of this language around the potential for AI to be this transformative force in the criminal justice system. At the same time, AI has also been a concept that's received a lot of pushback and criticism within both popular discourse and within academia. So specifically, criminal justice applications that have been termed AI have been become really popular case studies within academic circles regarding kind of the near-term social implications of artificial intelligence. And up here I just have a few different headlines that represent quite a wide range of technologies that have fallen underneath this heading of artificial intelligence. And they're quite diverse. So it encompasses things such as predictive policing, facial recognition, which are technologies that are based on machine learning, other computational techniques that really have emerged in this age of big data, when we have increasingly large amounts of data on which we can develop some of these systems. But it's also included things like risk assessment and other decades-old actuarial tools that really aren't anything new when it comes to kind of technologies that are used in the criminal justice system and are based on more old-school statistical techniques like logistic regression. Broadly speaking, though, all of these technologies can be characterized as a mixture of new and old statistical methods that are based on probability, trying to measure the strength of an association between a given set of inputs and an outcome of interest. And at their core, these methods are correlational. Their outputs typically come in the form of distributions or probabilities, which are framed as forecasts or predictions of future events. So what I'm going to argue today, though, is we actually shouldn't try to define artificial intelligence in terms of any sort of specific technological regimen. But instead, what I'd like to say is that in the context of the U.S. penal system, the term AI has been invoked within an interesting and contested discourse of reform, one that's best understood as the most recent incarnation in a long lineage of state efforts to try to reassert legitimacy during times of significant social change and upheaval. In the field of criminology as well as sociology, the analysis and interpretation of crime data has always served as a critical point of departure between more positivist subfields of the discipline, which tend to seek to try to measure and manage criminal behavior within kind of risky populations. And then there are also critical scholars who tend to conceive of crime as primarily the byproduct of criminalizing discourses and practices that are carried out by the carceral state. I've been really inspired by the work of a Harvard historian named Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who wrote this book, The Condemnation of Blackness, which traces the emergence of crime statistics to the beginning of the 20th century, when we saw crime statistics serve as kind of a means of justifying disparate treatment of different racial populations within the United States at the turn of the 19th century. This was during a time when the demographics of American cities were undergoing a significant change because of industrialization, as well as a massive influx of migrant populations, both African Americans from the U.S. South, as well as European immigrants who are now coming to these urban hubs in the North. During this time, we saw actually the emergence of sociology and criminology as disciplines within the academy that were particularly interested in studying kind of the defective and delinquent classes that were flocking to these cities in mass during this time. This is also a time when bioscientific theories of regarding the inferiority of the black population in the United States, things like eugenics, were starting to crumble under empirical scrutiny. And as a result, statistics that illustrated the overrepresentation of African Americans in U.S. prisons began to serve as the empirical basis for new pseudoscientific theories around the inherent criminality of the black population. And it was also used to justify their exclusion from really foundational critical social services such as education. Professor Muhammad really illustrates this in his work by surfacing some quotes like this one from the former governor of Mississippi, James Vardaman, who in 1905 said, "To school the Negro is to increase his criminality. Official statistics do not lie, and they tell us that the Negroes who can read and write are more criminal than the illiterate. In New England, where they are best educated, they are 4.5 times as criminals as in the Black Belt, where they are most ignorant. The more money for Negro education, the more Negro crime. This is the unmistakable showing of the U.S. Census." So, as we can see here, the authority of official statistics is very much invoked as kind of this rationale around excluding African Americans from one of the basic, foundational things that people need in order to kind of build a better life for the next generation. And this was happening at a time when many of those same scholars were actually interpreting very similar statistics about the overrepresentation of European immigrants as a call to action for poverty alleviation at the beginning of the progressive era, which is, I think, illustrated in this quote, which says, "The whole problem of crime, as today expressed in society, is summed up in the problem of poverty. We have churches enough, schools enough, moral sentiment enough to regenerate the world in a decade, were it not for the awful pressure brought to bear on 9/10 of the human race, which all but forces them to be vicious." So what we see is, in a quote like this, is European criminality was really attributed to structural inequalities and poverty, whereas black criminality was understood to be rooted in personal pathologies and inherent cultural inferiorities. And according to Muhammad, as black Americans were criminalized via statistical discourse, the public became increasingly sympathetic to the plights of poor European Americans via these same kinds of statistics. So in this context, crime statistics were not only a byproduct of racist ideas, but the very justification for them. Now, this inconsistent and racialized interpretation of crime statistics was challenged at the time by a number of academics, particularly African American scholars coming out of the Atlanta School of Sociology. For example, we had professors like Kelly Miller, who was coming out of Howard University's sociology department, who, in response to Governor Vardaman's statements, wanted to point out that yes, indeed, while it was true that it was 4.5 times more likely for somebody to be incarcerated in the North if they were African American, white men were actually 10 times more likely to be incarcerated in the North. And he pointed this out not only to kind of talk about the inconsistency of the logic that was deployed by Governor Vardaman, but also to talk about the way we might want to think about interpreting these statistics. So rather than trying to draw a conclusion about, inherent differences in the criminality between, our southern population and our northern population in the United States, he pointed to organizational and kind of bureaucratic differences that probably were the reason why these statistics looked different. So New England being an area that had much more kind of developed institutions at the time, had a much more sophisticated record-keeping apparatus, probably just had a much more comprehensive view into their prison population than what was available in the South. So there were a number of critiques like this that emerged from the Atlanta school, but most of them were systematically suppressed by the academy, particularly in places like the University of Chicago, which was immensely influential at the time in really shaping the theoretical and methodological foundations of criminology in the United States. What I'd like to argue today is that contemporary debates regarding artificial intelligence in criminal law are best understood as just the most recent incarnation of this contested statistical discourse. One which is occurring at a time when the legitimacy of the carceral state is being called into question in the United States. So over the last 2 decades, we've seen some pretty significant developments in the way law enforcement kind of carries out their work in the U.S. One is that we've seen a massive expansion in data collection, particularly in the wake of 9/11, when we saw kind of some pretty significant shifts in kind of the organizational logic of law enforcement agency, very much towards a logic of preemption and widespread surveillance. And this included things like adopting closed-circuit camera networks and acoustic sensors, federally funded body cameras, a massive expansion of biometric data collection and forensic DNA databases, as well as the entrance of a new, what I've heard a few different probation officers call growth industry of digital tracking devices for people who have come into contact with the criminal justice system in different ways. Another significant development we've seen had actually started to emerge in the wake of the 2008 recession, when we saw pretty significant demographic shifts, particularly in our urban and suburban hubs in the United States. So what we saw was an influx of pretty wealthy and white communities coming into like dense urban centers that had traditionally been or historically been occupied by low-income communities of color, which resulted in those low-income communities being pushed out to suburban areas. And as a result, we saw kind of a collapse of formerly segregated spaces, which made it harder for people to identify intruders in different areas. And this led to a demand for more spatialized and militarized policing practices that actually ended up transforming minority locales into these prison-like spaces beyond prison walls, and led to many more kind of high-profile and violent encounters with law enforcement within these minority communities. So in response to these developments, what we've seen, particularly in the last 5 to 8 years, is really a groundswell of political activity as abolitionist social movements have begun to emerge to challenge these developments. The most high-profile one and well-known one being Black Lives Matter, of course. And Black Lives Matter has explicitly aligned their cause with an abolitionist theory of change. One which focuses on creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment through the elimination of the tools and practices which legitimate and perpetuate carceral practices of various forms. But it's not just Black Lives Matter. We've also seen around the country local community organizations starting to gain traction in lobbying for the elimination of practices that fuel detention. So particularly one that's been of interest to me is the push to eliminate cash bail, which is a major driver of pretrial detention in the United States right now. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. There are also organizations who've begun to make explicit links between the expansion of surveillance and the perpetuation of mass incarceration. So that includes organizations like the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, as well as the Media Mobilizing Project. All of these organizations have embraced this abolitionist framework in their work, which seeks to kind of challenge the systems on the level of kind of epistemology. So abolition aims to kind of fundamentally reformulate the key concepts which guide criminological work, such as crime and punishment and safety, with the ultimate goal being that they want to move beyond kind of the default logics and assumptions of the carceral state in order to address more foundational types of violence that are carried out by law enforcement practices. So in response to this political activity, we've seen a new authoritative discourse and reform emerge, one which centers the use of data-driven technologies, which have often been branded as artificial intelligence. These developments are fueled in part by a growing appetite and availability of data from within government agencies. And this in turn has attracted large tech companies such as IBM, Amazon, Palantir to seek out government partnerships in order to gain access to this data. And this is really seen as a way to gain a competitive edge in this kind of arms race to hone predictive analytics, artificial intelligence platforms of various sorts. So these public-private partnerships have really given rise to a whole slew of new technologies which have been branded as artificial intelligence. But as I mentioned earlier, this umbrella term, artificial intelligence, also includes older technologies like risk assessment. So in those cases, what I understand is kind of a process of rebranding happening during these times when we're seeing big pushes for things like PreTrial Reform. This reform discourse is further bolstered by academia and private foundations, which often foreground engineering and data science as the key skill sets that are needed to quote-unquote drive social impact through technical innovation. In a wide range of high-stakes policy realms, the criminal justice realm being one of the most popular. We're seeing these different think tanks and research efforts pop up all across academia. Things like the Chicago Crime Lab, the Stanford Computational Policy Lab, USC's Center for Artificial Intelligence in Society, and my very own MIT, of which I am very much the recipient, we've also received now millions of dollars to study AI, ethics and governance, and criminal justice is one of our big focuses. So I'm very much implicated in these developments as well. We also have major private foundations who have also really embraced this rhetoric around data-driven reform within criminal justice. That includes the MacArthur Foundation, the Koch Foundation, the Arnold Foundation. There are a number of them which talk about now data-driven reform. One idea that features prominently in this new conversation about reform is the issue of racial profiling and bias. So in response to research which has illustrated kind of the persistent and growing racial disparities in things like arrest and incarceration, we've seen a number of leaders call for the adoption of algorithms which can increase the accuracy and efficiency of criminal justice processes by checking the implicit bias of decision makers within the system. The idea is that we can check the implicit bias of key decision makers like judges and police and prosecutors by presenting them with more accurate evidence-based claims about the likelihood of future events. And I find this framing particularly interesting for two reasons. One is it tends to circumscribe the problem of disparate impact in terms of individually held beliefs, rather than as the byproduct of organizational practices or top-down policies. So that's one. The other one is that historical crime data tends to be characterized as objective fact, or as Donna Haraway might call a view from nowhere, that's placed in contrast to some flawed and fickle subjectivity of a human decision maker. And I think this is really clearly illustrated in the case study of, for example, pretrial risk assessment, which I'm going to try to use throughout this presentation as kind of an illustrative example of some of the main points I want to talk about. So by way of background, over the last 4 years, I'd really say, in recent times, there's been a really big push to decrease pretrial detention in the United States, which has been fueled largely by abusive bail-setting practices, whereby people are detained because they're unable to pay the amount of bail that the judge has set for them. Now, rather than eliminate cash bail, many reformers have proposed that we adopt risk assessments, which could help judges distinguish kind of signal from noise when making decisions about who to release before their trial date. These pretrial release decisions are often framed in terms of life and death, so really as high-stakes decisions that there is very little room for error in. So I've actually interviewed a number of judges who've told me their biggest fear when making pretrial release decisions is that they'll release somebody who will go on to murder somebody on the street or something like that. And as a result of this kind of framing, predictive accuracy has almost become this fetishized measure of a tool's value within the system. So it doesn't matter why a prediction is accurate so long as it is. And I think this is most compellingly illustrated in a quote by a professor from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Richard Burke, who's both a statistician and a criminologist, and a big proponent of pretrial risk assessments. And he said in 2013, I'm not trying to explain criminal behavior, I'm trying to forecast it. If shoe size or sunspots predicts a person's going to commit a homicide, I want to use that information, even if I have no idea why it works. Yeah. What's interesting to me, though, is that this idea of accuracy has also really figured prominently in mainstream critiques of these same tools. So there are a growing number of researchers who are trying to understand how protected class attributes like race and gender mediate the accuracy of outputs in these types of tools. And I think the most high-profile example that probably everybody in this room knows is ProPublica's investigative report from 2016. Which argued that pretrial risk assessments were not only not very accurate, and by not very accurate I mean around 60% accurate, but that the brunt of that inaccuracy was disproportionately borne by historically marginalized groups, particularly African Americans, which was one of the groups they focused in on the report. And they framed this discrepancy of in accuracy in terms of bias. So they talked about algorithmic tools as running the risk of amplifying or reproducing pre-existing biases in the system. And these concerns have given rise to now what's quite an influential community for both within academia as well as industry, which is interested in the study of fair, accountable, and transparent algorithms. So what I'm going to do next is kind of talk about some of the major framings and efforts that are going, that are taking place within this community of fat algorithms, which is often the awkward shorthand for that. The first framing is really around this idea of trying to quantify trade-offs by mapping mathematical formalisms onto complex legal concepts such as discrimination, disparate impact, equity, affirmative action. With the goal being that these researchers want to lay a foundation for more robust debates about the social desirability of these tools by giving them conceptual precision in the form of these mathematical formalisms. In the context of pretrial risk assessment, there have been a number of different fairness definitions that have emerged, but there are really two that people talk about a lot. So the first one is really kind of like the main kind of like traditional way that statisticians think about whether or not their tool is fair, which is whether or not a tool is well calibrated across all groups, which means basically if I bin or break up the distribution and categorize people in a certain way, the people within each categories, each label, are going to have roughly the same kind of likelihood of possessing a certain quality or exhibiting some kind of behavior. So everybody in this high-risk group has about the same likelihood of, say, for example, being rearrested down the line. ProPublica and other folks have argued, though, that instead of thinking about calibration across groups, what we should really be concerned with is actually balancing the rates of false positives and false negatives across different groups, particularly given that these tools are only a little bit better than a coin flip at predicting the outcomes that they're most interested in. So in this case, what people are calling for is really saying that your likelihood of being mislabeled, mischaracterized as at high risk of being rearrested should be the same regardless of whether or not you're black or white, male or female. Recent work has shown, though, that these two fairness criteria are actually mutually incompatible unless you A, have a perfectly accurate tool, which will never happen, or B, the base rate of criminal activity across all of these different groups is the same. Base rate being that people are engaging in criminal activity. What's the rate at which people are engaging in criminal activity? Typically, when people talk about criminal activity, the proxy that they use for that is arrest data. Unequal base rates has been kind of characterized as this endemic issue across groups, rather than, for example, the byproduct of, say, discriminatory policing practices. And I think that's well illustrated in this quote above, which says, differences in false positive rates often tell us more about the underlying populations than about bias in the algorithm. False positive rates can mechanically increase with a group's overall rate of recidivism. In Broward County, which is where the ProPublica case study came from, black defendants appear to reoffend more often than whites. And so a higher false positive rate is an expected consequence of any algorithm that accurately captures each individual's risk. So we can unpack this, here, we're talking about accuracy, mostly in terms of calibration, so that our risk assessment that's well calibrated is likely to render higher false positive rates for groups that seem to engage in crime at higher rates, given arrest data that we have. And so, given that, there's this idea that accuracy is actually kind of fundamentally in tension with attempts to meet other fairness criteria, such as balancing the rate of false positives within a group. We'll dig in more into that later, but I'm going to move on to the second major framing. Oh, no, I'm not. Sorry, I'm looking at the next slide. So within the case of risk assessment, this is really interesting because it's been used as a way of warning against actually trying to meet these other fairness criteria, because the people who we've characterized as the victims of overzealous false positive rates, historically marginalized communities, are actually also the groups that would be most victimized by diminishing the accuracy of these tools. And I'll read you guys another quote which exhibits this from Dr. Berg. So by far the leading cause of death among young African American males is homicide. The most likely perpetrators of those homicides are other young African American males. There are legitimate concerns about fair risk assessments for accused perpetrators, but no such concerns about the consequences of fair risk assessments for their possible victims. Is that fair? So here we see that accuracy is really posited as the most important value to uphold in these situations, because the communities that bear the burden of those false positives are the same communities that would actually benefit from this type of profiling, given the grave dangers of murder and things like that. Now we'll talk more about that later. So the second major framing that's become popular within this community around fair algorithms is this man versus machine formulation, which really tries to say, rather than trying to get mixed up in all these sticky, incompatible fairness criteria, why don't we just try to make some incremental gains in how accurate these high-stake decisions are? So a lot of these scholars like to point to literature from psychology, kind of decision-making sciences of various sorts, which have shown that algorithms tend to outperform humans when making predictions around things like recidivism. And the main reason being that algorithms have a systematic way of identifying factors that are deemed predictive of that future outcome. So there's a way of distinguishing signal from noise that judges aren't able to do as systematically. Some scholars have tried to prove this or demonstrate this empirically within the context of the criminal justice system, but that's actually proven quite difficult to do. And the reason for that is we don't have counterfactual data regarding people who are actually incarcerated. So we don't know what an incarcerated person would have done had they been released from jail. So it makes it really hard for us to talk about the accuracy of those decisions. But that hasn't stopped people from trying to make these types of assertions around algorithms versus human decision makers. The way that usually works is they try to impute or make inferences about what would have happened based on similarly situated people who were released. And based on those types of kind of statistical hoop jumps, they've made these claims, pretty high-profile, well-cited claims, which say, in fact, risk assessments are more accurate than judges in making these types of predictions. And as a result, they've argued that, hey, listen, risk assessments, other algorithmic prediction tools, they really could serve as this force of equity. If only we could, develop pragmatic best practices for minimizing bias, which leads to kind of this third major framing, which is around pragmatic best practices, which really seek to minimize well-known kind of traditional notions of bias from within this kind of statistical literature. Things like sample bias, which occurs when algorithms are trained on data that do not reflect the population on which they're ultimately used. One recent study, for example, found that commercial facial recognition software that was designed to infer gender tended to perform worse on dark-skinned individuals than it did on light-skinned individuals. And it's been understood that these differences in accuracy are largely due to the fact that dark-skinned individuals are not very well represented in the data sets on which these algorithms are trained. So as a result, people have taken these types of case studies and said, hey, listen, what we need to come up with are best practices around regular validation on representative data so that we can continue to get rid of biases such as sample bias down the line. What I want to argue, though, in the next half of the talk is that bias and accuracy are actually inadequate conceptual anchors for this conversation around the social stakes of these predictive technologies, particularly in the criminal justice system, because they fail to interrogate the deeper theoretical and methodological premises on which these tools are based. So we're about at the halfway point. Are you guys still with me? We're doing good? Okay, cool. So all of the arguments that I just kind of outlined, I think, regarding the accuracy of these tools are built on a shared epistemological assumption that arrest, conviction, and incarceration data are best interpreted as information about that reflect individual proclivities towards crime, rather than as data that reflect deeper historical disparities in how the police and court officials treat different groups. Scholars have long argued that not only are crime statistics partial and biased, but that incompleteness of the way we think of crime is clearly delineated along power lines. So, some clear and interesting examples are from, say, for example, the 1960s, when, arrest statistics, many activists were arguing that arrest statistics were best understood as measurements of law enforcement practices. That crime tended to, the law enforcement tended to focus on street crimes that were carried out in kind of low-income communities while neglecting other illegal activities that were carried out in more affluent and white contexts. So in the 1960s, the peak of the civil rights movement, the anti-war protests and things like that, we had groups like the American Friends Service Committee, which argued that actions that clearly ought to be labeled criminal because they bring the greatest harm to the greatest number are in fact accomplished officially by agencies of government. Hundreds of unlawful killings by police go unprosecuted each year. And in the Vietnam War, America has violated its constitution and international law. So statements like this really are trying to point out the tenuous relationship between what actions are designated a crime and what actions actually bring the most harm to our communities. Arguing that we actually, the way we designate criminal activity often serves to criminalize the weak and protect the powerful. This is also true for actions that we actually have designated a crime but actually pursue arrest and prosecution in very different ways for different populations. So, the most probably well-known example of this was the way that crack cocaine was prosecuted and punished versus powder cocaine in the United States, with crack cocaine being something that was largely used by very poor communities, mostly communities of color, and powder cocaine being used by very wealthy white users. Similarly, in the 1990s, we started hearing more conversations around the differential ways that marijuana was prosecuted, in spite of the fact that we know that comparable rates of usage exist of marijuana. African American males are prosecuted and convicted 5 to 8 times more frequently than white users of these drugs. So these types of case studies really try to point out that people are arrested and punished at very different rates for things that we've deemed criminal activity. Similarly, conviction and incarceration data primarily reflect the decision-making habits of judges and prosecutors and members of sentencing commissions, rather than a defendant's criminality or guilt. And I've got a number of headlines up here of different studies that have come out which illustrate racial disparities in the way sentencing happens, the way prosecutors decide to charge people for various crimes. And I think this research illustrates is really interesting because it also illustrates a fundamental shift in the way that we could interpret crime and court data. That these are claims, this type of research are making claims that actually make a fundamental shift in the way agency and responsibility is understood and reflected in these crime statistics and these prosecution statistics. away from kind of the antisocial behavior of risky individuals and towards a carceral system that arrests and prosecutes and incarcerates people in disparate ways. Yet this kind of recharacterization of criminal justice data is not nearly as common as it should be in the current moment of reform that we're living in. And most of the work that we're seeing being done today around algorithmic reform is based on this fallacy of misplaced agency, whereby we're trying to evaluate and measure criminal proclivities as opposed to understand and surface disparate treatment of individuals within the system. This fallacy of misplaced agency definitely exists within the risk assessment conversation. So this is that high-profile paper I was talking about, which has over 150 citations since it came out in 2017, and very much says that for convenience sake, we're going to include outcomes like rearrest under the big category of what we call crime. And in doing so, we're conflating the arrest of individuals with criminal activity or base rates of criminal activity across these different groups. The authors of this paper did that in order to be able to impute or make assertions about what people who are incarcerated would have done had they been released from jail, and in service of a larger argument around algorithms being more accurate than judges in making pretrial release decisions. But it's not, in the context of pretrial risk assessment, it's not just an issue of conflating arrests with criminality. It's actually more serious than that. What we're seeing is actually many risk assessments fuel a deeper conflation between arrest and dangerousness. So in the context of pretrial risk assessment, it's actually not constitutionally permissible to detain somebody before their trial in the U.S. unless they present a clear and present risk of flight or a clear and present danger to the community. Historically, dangerousness has been pretty ill-defined in the courts, and that's led to a pretty massive expansion in pretrial detention, even though the incidence of arrest for a violent offense within the pretrial release population is very, very low. Somewhere between less than 1% to about 3% of the population are arrested for crimes such as assault, battery, murder, rape, those types of things. This low prevalence of violence crime actually makes it quite difficult to make actuarial tools that can predict the incidence of violent crime better than a coin flip. And the reality is, even if you could predict this pretty accurately, everybody who is subject to a risk assessment would probably come off as low risk, just because the odds are very low for everybody. Like, it's just not a common set of events to have happen. But rather than abstain from trying to predict violent criminal activity, the developers of most of these pretrial risk assessments have opted instead to substitute general rearrest data, things such as loitering, trespassing, jaywalking, substitute those types of data as a measure of the potential for dangerousness down the line, in order to get a stronger relationship between the inputs that they put into these models and the outputs in the end. And I think that's best reflected up here. This is a dashboard for a really popular tool, pretrial risk assessment tool, and you'll see two risk measures here: new criminal activity and failure to appear. This risk tool also has a measure for new violent criminal activity, but they don't include it on these dashboards. Instead, they just include this measure of new criminal activity, which is based on generalized arrest data. And if you're rated as high risk, you'll see a warning come up that says elevated risk of violence. So very clear kind of link being established here between rearrest and violence. This conflation has serious ripple effects for defendants. There's well-documented evidence that when somebody's incarcerated before their trial date, it can affect housing stability. It can put you in jeopardy of losing your job, and you're much more likely actually to be convicted of the crime you've been charged with. And these concerns are often acknowledged by proponents of risk assessments, but then they're also often placed right alongside fears of rape and murder and assault, which I think is reflected in this comment here from a paper that was just published maybe 2 months ago by Cass Sunstein over at Harvard, who said, If defendants are incarcerated, the long-term consequences can be very severe. Their lives can be ruined. But if defendants are released, they might flee the jurisdiction or commit crimes. People might be assaulted, raped, or killed. Now, he wrote this in a paper called Algorithms, Correcting Biases. And the bigger argument of the paper is that algorithms, like we've mentioned before, could serve to course correct some well-known cognitive pitfalls of judges and other decision makers. Pitfalls like availability bias, which is a bias whereby we overestimate the likelihood of a given event occurring, say, for example, a shark attack, because of the frequency with which it kind of invoked in popular discourse or in the media or whatever. What I think is kind of like perhaps sadly ironic here is I think this type of continuous invocation of the risk of assault and rape and murder, which is usually placed right alongside these other very real and known risks and harms of pretrial detention, might actually end up fueling the very biases that they're purporting to try to mitigate, because we're talking about them as if they're these very common instances that are happening all of the time. So predictive algorithms that are based on these widespread mischaracterizations of the data, I think, underpin a moral economy that justifies the exclusion and repression of marginalized populations through the construction of risky or dangerous profiles. The political economy of algorithmic systems rests largely on the fallacy of misplaced agency to make authoritative claims about an individual's criminal proclivities. More representative framings of the data would produce less powerful claims. They would be claims such as likelihood of rearrest, or they would give rise to a different set of research questions that would directly challenge the practices and logics of the carceral state by trying to ask questions around, disparate treatment of different groups by the system itself. Now, in the present moment, there are people who are protesting this characterization of criminal justice data. Here's a public letter that was issued and signed by over 100 civil rights organizations just last year, in which they said, the data driving many predictive algorithms, such as prior failures to appear and arrest rates, are profoundly limited. Decades of research have shown that such data primarily document the behavior and decisions of police officers and prosecutors, rather than the individuals or groups that the data are claiming to describe. They've beautifully summarized the point I've been trying to convey for the last 10 minutes. So in doing so, in making these types of arguments, the signers of this letter have joined a long lineage of critical scholars and activists who've contested the interpretation of crime statistics. And what I'd like to argue today is that the discourse regarding fair and accountable and transparent algorithms in AI is just the most recent incarnation of this historical struggle over the interpretation of justice data. To date, the lion's share of research in this area has uncritically embraced the epistemological assumptions of mainstream criminology. And in doing so, they continue a long tradition of centering reforms of what Michael Lynch called the sciences of oppression, which seek to profile and surveil marginalized communities. So this scholarship not only provides a mechanism for the confinement and control of the quote-unquote dangerous classes, but it also creates the very processes through which these populations are turned into deviants to be controlled and feared. So where do we go from here? I think the first step is really for us to fundamentally recharacterize and reframe the role of science and the study of crime in producing meaningful change in criminal justice by understanding this tension between mainstream academic work and more critical scholars during these moments of political upheaval. I think the case of facial recognition is perhaps the most advanced in terms of this discourse and this tension in both academic circles as well as mainstream press, because as I mentioned before, we've seen a big push towards trying to increase the diversity and improve the representation of minority groups within the data sets that facial recognition algorithms are trained on for the purpose of improving the accuracy of them over time. And what we've seen, though, is actually a number of both activists and critical scholars push back on this framing of the problem and the solution. This is a quote from a piece by an activist named Nabil Hussain, who said, The reality of the foreseeable future is that the people who control and deploy facial recognition technology at any consequential scale will predominantly be our oppressors. Why should we desire our faces to be legible for efficient automated processing by systems of their design? The struggle for liberation is not a struggle for diversity and inclusion. It is a struggle for decolonization, reparations, and self-determination. So in this quote, Hussein recontextualizes the issue of artificial intelligence within a structural critique of the carceral state as a fundamentally punitive system of social control. And in doing so, he rejects the attempts made to improve the accuracy of technologies that are designed to make this system more efficient. Hussein then proposes a different set of values on which to base a counter-imaginary about the future of the carceral state, one which centers the pursuit of agency and healing within historically marginalized communities. It's important to note, though, that this approach does not reject wholesale the use of data and technology in the carceral state, but rather it requires a radical reformulation of the key concepts and assumptions which undergird the adoption of new technologies in this context. It requires a shift away from, for example, trying to measure criminal proclivities to trying to measure processes of criminalization, from supporting law and order to increasing community safety and self-determination, and from surveillance of risky populations towards accountability for state officials. So really what I think Nabil is asking us to do is really try to shift the assumptions that undergird the adoptions of these technologies and the type of research we do. And I think there are three major assumptions that I'm the most interested in. One is, what are the questions that are worth asking? And then what are the data that constitute relevant and authoritative evidence to answer those questions? And finally, what epistemological assumptions should be used to make claims based on the available evidence? What I'd like to do is, talk about some of the work I've been trying to do in trying to support and identify groups that are actually engaging in the area of pretrial reform based on a different set of assumptions. In the case of pretrial reform, there have been various attempts, legislative attempts, as well as like state Supreme Court efforts to try to reduce the use of cash bail and really change kind of court practices around bail. That includes state Supreme Court orders, which have mandated, for example, that judges inquire about ability to pay before setting bail, as well as kind of legislative efforts, which have outlined statutory guidelines around the use of cash bail for low and moderate risk defendants using risk assessments. Now, in most places, we have no idea about how those efforts at reform are actually translating into court practices on a daily basis. And that's either because the data needed to answer basic questions about these reforms is either not collected, or it is collected but it's not made available to the public for deeper scrutiny about these reforms. So as a result, around the country we've seen what we call court watching efforts pop up, which are basically efforts to train lay people to go into courtrooms, observe the proceedings of the court, and actually collect data about the behavior and decisions of judges and prosecutors primarily. And I've been involved in supporting that work within Massachusetts, where currently CourtWatch MA has been engaged in a first 100 days campaign. So we just elected a new district attorney in Suffolk County. A lot of people were excited about the election of Rachel Rollins because she actually made some pretty specific commitments around how she was going to decline to prosecute certain types of charges, and then also decline to ask for bail for different kinds of charges. So we've had dozens of court watchers going into the court since January and really trying to document. This might be a little small for people to read, but this is today's day 50, halfway through, and just kind of a summary of what people have observed, such as racial disparities are still pronounced, and that charges that Rachel Rollins pledged to decline are still being prosecuted. People still held on unaffordable bail, stuck in jail on crimes of poverty. So very much the focus right now is trying to do a rapid turnaround where we collect data on a weekly basis, try to run some analysis on that data and then push it out as part of this continuous pressure to hold Rachel Rollins accountable for her promises. And so far, it's interesting because we are seeing steady improvements. We can't take full responsibility for that, but it's really exciting to see this rapid kind of translation of data into conversations about accountability and actually see results. Court watching efforts are also working to expand the types of data that are collected in order to measure the harms and benefit of different carceral technologies that have been posited as alternatives to pretrial detention, things like electronic monitoring and mandatory drug testing. Many of these technologies right now are not very studied in the pretrial context, but where they are studied, the academic scholarship across the board pretty much eliminates any sort of input from people who are actually subjected to these technologies and don't actually engage with the population who's the most impacted at all. So what's really interesting is that court watch efforts are really trying to surface the lived experiences of people who are being subjected to these types of technologies as an alternative to detention. And in doing so, I think Court Watch is trying to wrest back control over what's considered authoritative knowledge and expertise in these contexts by centering the voices of lay people like court watchers, as well as the lived experiences of people who are directly impacted by these new technological regimes. And in doing so, I think they're really laying a path forward around how you might think about engaging with creating data, analyzing data, expanding what we think of as data from an abolitionist perspective. So for me, an abolitionist understanding of the role and function of the carceral state provides us with the opportunity to fundamentally reformulate the types of questions we ask, the way we characterize existing data, and how we identify and fill gaps in existing data regimes in the carceral state. The igniting of an abolitionist imaginary is especially important in the current political moment, when the term artificial intelligence has been deployed as a means of justifying and depoliticizing the expansion of state and private surveillance amidst this growing crisis of legitimacy. And under the authoritative rubric of evidence-based reform and AI, law enforcement officials have really reframed these contentious social issues in terms of technocratic shortcomings, issues of information access and interpretation. I think that efforts to increase the accuracy of predictive and evaluative systems like this run the risk of circumscribing deeper ideological and epistemological struggles within these narrow technocratic debates about how we make these processes more valid and accurate and fair. For me, the key question is whether or not predictive tools reflect and reinforce punitive practices that drive disparate outcomes in these systems, and how data regimes interact with those ideologies to naturalize those practices. Conversations regarding the ethical stakes of AI and criminal law must interrogate the default logics and assumptions of the carceral state in order to address the foundational violence of law enforcement and courtroom practices. Only then, I think, can we hope to reimagine the use of data and technology in this context in order to explore and create lasting alternatives in the future. So with that, I'm finished. Thank you so much.